I remember that night with the kind of clarity that only comes from moments that split your life in two. There was a before, and there was an after, and this was the thin line between them. The apartment was never warm enough in February. Our landlord had promised us the radiator worked, but it only managed a tired clicking sound every few minutes, like an old man clearing his throat. I lay on my side of the living room couch, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked different in every light. Books surrounded me like a fortress: American literature, modern poetry, a notebook half filled with thoughts I would never speak aloud. The lamp in the corner cast everything in amber, making shadows dance across the walls in ways that felt almost alive. Across the room, maybe 8 feet away, but it could have been an ocean, Elias shifted under his blanket. It was thin, that blanket. I had watched him pull it from the hall closet when we first moved in together, watched him shake it out with the kind of casual confidence he brought to everything. The fabric was worn soft from years of use, faded blue with tiny holes near the edges. Now it barely covered him from chest to knees. I could hear his breathing, steady but restless, the way someone breathes when they are trying to fall asleep but cannot quite let go of consciousness. The sound filled the quiet spaces between the radiator's complaints. Outside, winter pressed against our windows with patient persistence. No snow tonight, just the kind of cold that seeps through glass and settles into your bones. This was our life. Two college students thrown together by a housing assignment neither of us had particularly wanted. We had been living like this for months now. Parallel lives intersecting only in the shared spaces of kitchen counters and bathroom schedules. I studied while he played guitar. He brought friends over while I retreated to the library. We existed in the same space without truly occupying it together. Until tonight. I was thinking about nothing and everything when his voice cut through the quiet. He spoke without lifting his head from his pillow, his words aimed at the ceiling rather than at me. "Do you want to share a blanket?" he said, and there was something almost apologetic in his tone, as if he were embarrassed by his own request. "It's just, I don't know. It feels cold tonight. Feels lonely, too." The words hung in the air between us like a bridge I had never expected to see. My heart began to race in a way that seemed disproportionate to such a simple question. Share a blanket. For words that meant nothing and everything at the same time. I had spent so many nights on this couch, wrapped in my own careful solitude, listening to the sounds of his life happening just a few feet away. The rustle of pages turning. The soft thud of a book hitting the floor when sleep finally claimed him. The way he sometimes talked in his sleep, fragments of conversations with people I would never know. I had memorized these sounds without meaning to, the way you memorize a song that plays too often on the radio. But this was different. This was an invitation. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment in ways I could not have explained to anyone, least of all to myself. There were boundaries we had established without discussion, invisible lines drawn around personal space, around the kinds of intimacy that were acceptable between roommates, between men, between friends who barely knew each other outside the shared experience of being young and displaced and trying to figure out how to live. And yet something in his voice made those boundaries feel suddenly arbitrary. He sounded small in the darkness, smaller than his usual easy confidence would ever allow in daylight. Lonely, he had said. The honesty of it caught me off guard. I pulled my blanket across the space between us without saying anything in response. The couch was long enough that we could share its expanse without touching, but when I settled beside him, our shoulders brushed. Just barely. Just enough to register the warmth of another human body in the cold apartment. Just enough to change everything. We lay there in the darkness, two young men tangled not in romance yet, but in something more fragile and unnamed. The simple warmth of shared space. The quiet acknowledgement of need. The weight of a moment that seemed small enough to dismiss, but felt large enough to rearrange the very air between us. Neither of us spoke after that. The radiator continued its tired clicking. The shadows continued their dance across the walls. But something had shifted, something I could not name and would not understand until much later. In the space of a few words and a shared blanket, we had crossed a line neither of us had known existed. I listened to his breathing slow and deepen as sleep finally found him. I remained awake for hours, staring at that water stain on the ceiling, feeling the unfamiliar weight of his presence beside me. And somewhere in those quiet hours, I began to understand that some invitations change you simply by being offered, regardless of whether you are ready for what they might mean. That night marked the beginning of something I could not yet name, but it did not change the rhythm of our days. We woke the next morning as we always did, awkwardly, separately, pretending the shared warmth had been nothing more than a practical solution to a cold apartment. Elias stretched and yawned and disappeared into the bathroom with his usual easy energy. I folded the blankets with careful precision, restoring the invisible boundary between his space and mine. Our campus was the kind of place where time seemed to move differently depending on where you stood. The main quad, with its centuries-old brick buildings and towering oak trees, felt eternal and unchanging. Students hurried between classes with the same urgency their predecessors had felt decades before. The library, where I spent most of my waking hours, existed in its own suspended reality. Light filtered through tall windows onto wooden tables scarred by generations of studying, and the silence was so complete you could hear the whisper of pages turning 3 tables away. I had always been comfortable in that silence. It matched something in my nature, a preference for observation over participation, for the safety of books over the unpredictability of people. My corner table on the 3rd floor became a kind of refuge, surrounded by stacks of poetry collections and literary criticism. I could disappear there for hours, lost in the careful analysis of other people's words, other people's truths. Elias belonged to a different part of campus entirely. I would see him sometimes in the dining hall, surrounded by a rotating cast of friends who seemed to gravitate toward him without effort. He had the kind of presence that made rooms feel more alive simply by his being in them. His laugh carried across spaces, warm and unguarded. People remembered conversations with him, sought him out between classes, invited him to parties I would never attend. When I watched him from a distance, and I did watch him, though I told myself it was mere curiosity, I saw someone who moved through the world with a confidence I had never possessed. He spoke to professors as if they were old friends. He knew the names of dining hall workers and security guards. He belonged here in a way that seemed effortless, natural, like he had been born knowing how to inhabit space without apology. Our apartment reflected these differences with startling clarity. My half of the living room was organized with the kind of precision that bordered on obsessive. Books arranged by author, then by publication date. Notes filed in labeled folders. A small desk where I worked with my back to the room, creating a cocoon of focused solitude. Everything in its place, everything serving a purpose. Elias lived in beautiful chaos. His guitar leaned against walls wherever he had last played it. Clothes formed comfortable piles on chairs and floors, not dirty exactly, but not quite clean either. His textbooks lay open to random pages, marked with coffee rings and scattered guitar picks that caught the light like small coins. He seemed to exist in the present moment completely, leaving a trail of his immediate needs and interests wherever he went. We had been assigned to live together by a housing computer that matched us based on practical considerations. Neither of us smoked. Both of us were juniors. Both of us had indicated we preferred quiet study environments. The algorithm could not have known that we would fit together like complementary pieces of some larger puzzle, filling spaces in each other's lives we had not realized were empty. Our daily routines became a kind of dance performed without choreography. I woke early, made coffee for both of us, left his mug on the counter where he would find it when he eventually emerged from his bedroom. He would stumble out in whatever clothes he had worn the day before, hair sticking up at impossible angles, and grunt his thanks before disappearing into the bathroom. By the time he was fully awake, I was usually gathering my books for the library, and we would pass each other in the hallway with the kind of polite acknowledgement that roommates master. But there were moments when the routine cracked open to reveal something underneath. When we found ourselves in the kitchen at the same time, reaching around each other for coffee or milk, our movements becoming an unconscious collaboration. When he would ask about my classes with genuine interest, leaning against the counter while I tried to explain the symbolism in whatever poem had captured my attention that week. When I would find him reading one of my books, looking up with an expression that seemed almost grateful for the discovery. The grocery store trips became something I looked forward to in ways I could not explain to myself. Every Thursday evening, we would walk the 6 blocks to the small market near campus, splitting the cost of milk and bread and whatever frozen meals we could afford on our student budgets. Elias would wander the aisles with the same easy curiosity he brought to everything else, stopping to read ingredient labels on foods he had no intention of buying, commenting on the music playing overhead, striking up conversations with other shoppers. I followed in his wake, watching him transform the mundane task of shopping into something that felt almost social, almost fun. Once, we both reached for the same apple at the same time. Our hands brushed for the briefest moment before I pulled mine away, and he laughed about it, making some joke about great minds thinking alike. The casual contact lasted maybe a second, but I felt the warmth of it for hours afterward. These were the moments that began to accumulate like sediment, building something beneath the surface of our ordinary coexistence. The way he would absently touch my shoulder when he wanted to get past me in the narrow kitchen. The way his eyes would find mine across the dining hall, and he would raise his coffee cup in a small salute of recognition. The way he had started leaving his door open when he practiced guitar, as if he wanted to share the music even when we were not sharing the same room. I told myself these gestures meant nothing beyond the natural intimacy that develops between people who share living space. Roommates who got along, who had settled into comfortable habits, who had learned to coexist without friction. But late at night, lying on my side of the couch, I would replay these small interactions with the kind of careful attention I usually reserved for literary analysis. There was something building between us, something that existed in the spaces between words, in the comfortable silences that had replaced awkward small talk, in the way our separate lives had begun to orbit around shared rituals. I did not have a name for it yet. I was not sure I wanted one. But it was there, growing stronger each day, like a plant reaching toward light through the cracks in concrete. And sometimes, when I caught him looking at me with an expression I could not quite read, I wondered if he felt it too. Winter deepened around us like a held breath, and with it came a restlessness in Elias that I had never seen before. He had always been social, but now he seemed almost desperate to fill the quiet spaces of our evenings. Instead of disappearing into his room after dinner or heading out to meet friends, he began to linger in our shared spaces with an intensity that felt both casual and deliberate. It started with small requests that felt like invitations to something I could not name. He would appear in the doorway while I was reading, keys jingling in his hand, and ask if I wanted to walk to the corner store with him. Not because we needed anything in particular, but because the apartment felt too small, too quiet, too much like a place where thoughts could echo off the walls until they became unbearable. I would close my book and follow him into the February night, our breath visible in the cold air as we walked the empty streets. The corner store was nothing special, fluorescent lights and crowded aisles selling overpriced necessities to students who had forgotten to plan ahead. But Elias would wander the aisles as if he were exploring a museum, picking up random items and making observations about their packaging or their placement that somehow turned a mundane errand into something that felt almost intimate. We would buy coffee or hot chocolate, sometimes a bag of chips we did not need, and walk back slowly, as if neither of us were eager to return to the apartment where our separate routines waited to claim us again. During these walks, he would talk about things he rarely mentioned in daylight, his uncertainty about his major, his complicated relationship with his father, the way he sometimes felt like he was performing a version of himself that everyone expected, but that left him feeling hollow. I listened with the kind of attention I usually reserved for poetry, storing away these revelations like precious things. In return, he would ask me questions that seemed designed to draw me out of my careful reserve. What did I think about when I spent all those hours in the library? Whether I ever got lonely surrounded by all those books? Whether I had always been so serious, or if it was something college had taught me? These conversations felt different from the polite exchanges we had mastered as roommates. They carried weight, implied intimacy, suggested that we were becoming something more than two people who happened to share an address. But I was afraid to examine this shift too closely, afraid that naming it would somehow make it disappear. The dining hall became another space where these small invitations multiplied. Elias would find me at my usual solitary table and ask if he could sit, bringing with him the kind of easy energy that made other students glance over with curiosity. He would tell me about his classes, his friends, his plans for the weekend. But underneath the casual conversation was something that felt almost like courtship, though I would not have used that word then. He had a way of leaning in when he talked, closing the distance between us until I could smell his shampoo, could see the small scar above his left eyebrow that he had gotten falling off his bike as a child. These moments of closeness felt accidental, natural, but they left me hyper-aware of my own breathing, my own careful responses to his proximity. The most significant change happened in our apartment during the quiet hours after dinner. Instead of retreating to his room or heading out to meet friends, Elias would suggest we watch something together. He would pull out that same faded blue blanket from the hall closet and spread it across the couch, patting the space beside him with the kind of casual invitation that felt anything but casual to me. We would sit together watching films neither of us really paid attention to, our shoulders touching, sometimes our knees, the blanket creating a small world that belonged only to us. Elias would make quiet comments about the actors or the plot, but I found myself focusing more on the sound of his voice, the way he absently touched my arm when he wanted to point something out on the screen, the steady rhythm of his breathing beside me. These evenings felt like a secret we were keeping from ourselves, an intimacy that existed in the spaces between acknowledgement and denial. I began to wait for them, to structure my days around the possibility that he might ask me to join him under that blanket again. The anticipation was almost unbearable, but so was the satisfaction when he would look at me and say, almost shyly, that he did not feel like being alone tonight. The catalyst came on a Thursday in early March when a late winter storm moved across the campus with unexpected ferocity. I was in the library when the lights began to flicker, and by the time I gathered my books and made it back to the apartment, half the campus was without power. The building manager had posted a notice in the lobby explaining that the outage was widespread, that power would not be restored until morning at the earliest. I climbed the stairs to our apartment in complete darkness, feeling my way along the familiar hallway by touch. When I opened the door, I found Elias sitting in the living room surrounded by candles he had found somewhere in our kitchen cabinets. The apartment was transformed, filled with warm, flickering light that turned everything soft and golden. He looked up when I entered, and there was something in his expression that seemed almost relieved, as if my return had completed some picture he had been waiting to see. The heater had stopped working when the power went out, and the temperature in the apartment was already dropping noticeably. Elias had wrapped himself in a jacket, but I could see him shivering slightly in the candlelight. Without the constant hum of electrical appliances, the silence felt profound, almost sacred. He did not ask this time. He simply pulled the blue blanket from its place on the back of the couch and spread it wide, looking at me with an expression that managed to be both invitation and question. I crossed the room and settled beside him. And this time when our bodies pressed together under the shared warmth, it did not feel accidental or awkward. It felt inevitable. We sat in the candlelit silence for a long time, neither of us speaking, both of us aware that something fundamental had shifted in the space between us. The storm continued outside, but inside our small circle of warmth and light, I felt safer than I had ever felt anywhere. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost whispered, as if he were afraid of disturbing something fragile. "Stay close," he said, his head finding my shoulder with the kind of natural ease that suggested he had been thinking about this moment long before it arrived. "Don't leave me in this emptiness." I did not move away. I could not move away. Something in me had been waiting for this invitation my entire life. Something fundamental shifted after that night in the candlelight. The storm passed. The power returned. and our daily routines resumed their familiar patterns, but I had been changed in ways I was only beginning to understand. The careful boundaries I had constructed around myself, walls built of silence, self-denial, and the kind of disciplined solitude I had perfected over years of practice, began to erode like shoreline sand beneath persistent waves. I found myself listening for the sound of his keys at the door with an attention that bordered on devotion. In the library, where I had once lost myself completely in the worlds contained within books, I would catch my mind wandering to thoughts of what Elias might be doing, whether he had eaten lunch, if he would be home when I returned. The poetry that had once absorbed me entirely now felt like a distraction from something more pressing, more immediate, more real than anything I could find in the careful arrangement of someone else's words. My corner table on the third floor became a place I visited out of habit rather than genuine desire. I would sit with my books spread before me, but instead of disappearing into analysis and interpretation, I found myself checking the clock with increasing frequency, calculating how much longer I needed to maintain the pretense of studying before I could justifiably return home. Home. The word had taken on new meaning, become synonymous not with our shared apartment, but with Elias's presence within it. The notebooks that had once been repositories for my thoughts, my observations about literature and life, began to fill with different kinds of entries. Instead of careful analysis of metaphor and meaning, I found myself writing about the way afternoon light fell across Elias's face when he sat by the window, the particular quality of his laughter when something genuinely surprised him, the unconscious gestures he made when he was thinking, running his hand through his hair, tapping his fingers against his knee, the small smile that played at the corners of his mouth when he was lost in his own thoughts. I began to linger in our shared spaces with what I told myself was casual interest, but what felt increasingly like deliberate choice. Instead of retreating to my desk after dinner, I would find reasons to remain in the living room, organizing books that did not need organizing, cleaning surfaces that were already clean, reading in the armchair instead of at my desk, positioning myself where I could observe the front door, where I would be visible and available when Elias returned from whatever evening activities had claimed his attention. The waiting became a kind of meditation, a state of heightened awareness where every sound in the hallway might signal his return. The elevator's mechanical hum, footsteps on the stairs that might or might not belong to him, the jingle of keys that could be his or could belong to any of our neighbors. When the sounds finally resolved into his specific rhythm, the particular way he took the stairs two at a time, the distinctive sound his key made in our lock, I would feel a rush of satisfaction so intense it was almost embarrassing. He seemed to sense this shift in me, this new availability, and he began to respond to it in ways that deepened our connection beyond anything I had thought possible between two men who had started as strangers thrown together by circumstance. Our conversations evolved from the polite exchanges of roommates to something that felt closer to the intimacy traditionally reserved for romantic relationships, though neither of us would have used that language to describe what was happening between us. Elias began to tell me things he said he had never told anyone else. Late at night, under our shared blanket, he would speak about his father, a man who had raised him with love, but also with a silence so profound it had shaped Elias's understanding of masculinity in ways he was only beginning to recognize. His father was a good man, Elias would say, but one who had never learned how to speak about the things that mattered most. Emotions were acknowledged through actions rather than words, love expressed through provision rather than declaration. This silence had left Elias with a deep well of loneliness that he carried beneath his easy social confidence. He could make friends effortlessly, could charm professors and classmates and strangers at parties, but he struggled to form connections that felt substantial, that went beyond surface-level pleasantries into the territories where real intimacy lived. He told me this with the kind of vulnerable honesty that felt like a gift, his head resting against my shoulder, his voice quiet in the darkness of our apartment. I listened to these revelations with what I can only describe as devotion. Every word felt precious, worth preserving, worth turning over in my mind long after he had fallen silent. I began to understand that my attention had become a kind of prayer, a focused offering of presence that he seemed to need as much as I needed to give it. In these moments, I felt useful in a way I had never experienced before, as if my natural inclination toward careful listening had found its perfect purpose. The physical intimacy between us deepened in increments so small they felt natural, inevitable. What had begun as accidental contact, shoulders brushing, knees touching, evolved into something more deliberate, though still unacknowledged. Elias would lean against me when we watched television, his weight settling into my side with the kind of casual trust that suggested he had stopped thinking about boundaries, stopped monitoring the space between our bodies. One evening in early April, after he had spent nearly an hour telling me about a phone call with his father that had left him feeling particularly isolated, Elias simply let himself fall asleep against me. Not gradually, not with the slow surrender to exhaustion that I had witnessed before, but suddenly, completely, as if my presence had given him permission to stop fighting whatever internal vigilance usually kept him alert. His head found the space between my shoulder and chest, and his breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of genuine sleep. The blanket was wrapped around both of us, but most of his weight was resting against me, trusting me to hold him steady while he let consciousness slip away. I sat frozen, afraid that any movement might wake him, might break the spell of whatever trust had allowed him to fall asleep in my arms. I remained awake for hours that night, memorizing everything about the moment. The weight of his head against my chest, the way his hair fell across his forehead in sleep, the sound of his breathing, deeper and more regular than when he was awake, occasionally interrupted by small sounds that might have been dreams. The warmth that radiated from his body, warming places in me I had not realized were cold. But with this deepening intimacy came a terror I had not anticipated. As I sat in the darkness holding Elias while he slept, I began to understand that I was approaching a precipice I had been unconsciously avoiding my entire life. The feelings building in me were not the simple affection of friendship, not the casual fondness of compatible roommates. They were something larger, more consuming, more dangerous than anything I had allowed myself to feel before. I loved him. The knowledge arrived with the kind of clarity that felt like physical impact, like something heavy dropping into still water. I loved the sound of his voice when he told me secrets in the darkness. I loved the way he made our ordinary apartment feel like home simply by being in it. I loved his restless energy, his easy laughter, his unconscious kindness toward people he barely knew. I loved the way he looked at me when he thought I had something worth hearing, as if my words carried weight he had been waiting for someone to offer. But acknowledging this love, even to myself, felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with no way of knowing how far the fall might be. To name what I felt would be to risk everything we had built together, the easy companionship, the shared rituals, the growing intimacy that existed in a space neither friendship nor romance, but something entirely its own. It would be to risk the ordinary life I had managed to construct, the identity I had spent years learning to inhabit, the safety that came from keeping the most dangerous parts of myself carefully hidden. I knew that Elias was straight. I had seen him with women, had listened to him talk about relationships and attraction in ways that left no room for ambiguity. What was happening between us lived in a space outside those categories, a kind of emotional intimacy that men were allowed to share as long as it remained unexamined, unacknowledged, unnamed. To speak of love would be to drag it into the light where it would have to be categorized, judged, accepted, or rejected according to rules neither of us had written, but both of us understood. As dawn approached and Elias continued to sleep against me, I realized I was facing a choice I was not ready to make. I could continue to exist in this liminal space, accepting whatever intimacy he was willing to offer while carefully avoiding the language that might destroy it. Or I could risk everything by telling him the truth about what I felt, what I wanted, what I had discovered about myself in the quiet hours of watching him sleep. The weight of his trust, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his hand had somehow found its way to rest against my chest. All of it felt like evidence of something reciprocal, something mutual, something that might survive the transition from unspoken to acknowledged. But it also felt fragile enough to shatter at the first wrong word, the first clumsy attempt to transform what we had into something that might not be able to exist in the world outside our shared apartment. I was changing, becoming someone I did not recognize, someone capable of feelings I had spent years learning to suppress. And with that change came the terrible understanding that there was no going back to the safety of not knowing, not feeling, not wanting what I was beginning to understand I wanted more than anything I had ever wanted before. Spring arrived on a Tuesday evening in late April with the kind of sudden warmth that made winter feel like something we had only imagined. Elias had been restless all day, pacing the apartment with an energy that seemed to match the changing season. When I returned from the library, I found him standing by the window watching rain fall in sheets against the glass, his face lit by the strange golden light that comes just before storms break. "We need to get out of here," he said without turning around. "I feel like I've been holding my breath for months." I did not argue. Something in his voice suggested that this was not really a request, and something in me had been waiting for exactly this kind of invitation. We pulled on jackets and stepped into the warm rain that soaked through our clothes within minutes. The campus was nearly empty, other students having retreated indoors to wait out the weather, but Elias seemed energized by the solitude, by the way the rain transformed familiar spaces into something mysterious and new. We walked for over an hour without any particular destination, following paths that led between buildings and around the small lake at the center of campus. Elias talked almost constantly, as if the movement and the rain had unlocked something in him that had been waiting to be released. He told me about dreams he had been having, about plans for summer, about books he wanted to read and places he wanted to see. His voice carried a kind of manic joy that was infectious, and I found myself laughing at observations that were not particularly funny, but felt profound in the context of our rain-soaked wandering. By the time we made our way back to the apartment, we were both thoroughly drenched, our clothes clinging to our bodies, our hair dripping onto the hallway carpet. Elias shook himself like a dog as soon as we were inside, sending water droplets across the living room, and then turned to look at me with an expression of pure delight. "That was exactly what I needed," he said, and then, without warning, he grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the couch. I followed him in a kind of daze, still processing the casual way he had reached for me, the natural ease of his touch, the way my skin seemed to burn where his fingers had made contact. He threw himself onto the couch with the abandon of someone who had rediscovered the simple pleasure of being inside, of being warm, of being safe from the storm that continued to rage beyond our windows. Before I could think about it, before I could retreat to my usual careful distance, he had pulled me down beside him, his wet clothes and mine creating a pool of dampness on the cushions that we would probably regret later, but that felt absolutely right in the moment. The blue blanket appeared as if by magic, pulled from its place and wrapped around both of us before I had fully settled into position. This time there was no hesitation, no careful negotiation of space and boundaries. Elias simply opened his arms, and I fell into them, our bodies fitting together with the kind of natural ease that suggested we had been designed for exactly this configuration. We sat like that for a long time, listening to the rain against the windows, feeling our clothes gradually dry against our skin, sharing warmth in the way that had become our most intimate ritual. Elias's breathing slowly returned to normal from the excitement of our walk, and I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat where my head rested against his chest. "This is nice," he said quietly, and his voice carried a note of something that might have been surprise, as if he had not expected this simple domestic scene to feel as satisfying as it did. "This feels right." The words landed in the space between us like a confession, and I felt something inside me crack open in response. Not breaking, exactly, but opening the way a flower opens, suddenly and completely, revealing something that had been hidden within. The truth I had been circling around, trying to contain, trying to rationalize into something manageable, finally demanded to be acknowledged in its full, overwhelming completeness. I loved him. Not the careful, manageable affection of friendship, not the admiration one might feel for someone whose company was pleasant and whose presence made ordinary moments feel less ordinary. I loved him with the kind of desperate, consuming intensity that poets wrote about, and that I had always assumed was either exaggeration or the province of people whose emotional lives were less carefully controlled than mine. I loved the way he transformed every space he entered simply by being present. I loved his unconscious kindness, the way he remembered details about people's lives that they had mentioned only once. I loved his restlessness, his need to move and explore and experience everything the world had to offer. I loved the way he made me feel brave enough to step outside the careful boundaries I had constructed around my own life. But more than that, and more dangerously, I loved the specific weight of his body against mine. I loved the smell of his shampoo and the way his hair fell across his forehead when he was thinking. I loved the sound he made when he was deeply asleep, the small sighs and shifts that suggested dreams I would never be able to share. I loved the casual way he reached for me now, as if my presence was something he had come to depend on, something necessary for his own sense of being settled and safe. The realization was so overwhelming that for a moment I could not breathe. Everything I had been trying to keep contained, everything I had been carefully rationing and managing and explaining away as something else, crashed over me with the force of the storm still raging outside our windows. I was in love with my roommate, my friend, my straight roommate who trusted me enough to fall asleep in my arms, but who would never be able to return what I felt for him. The terror of it was so complete that I had to resist the urge to pull away, to create distance, to retreat back into the safe isolation where such dangerous feelings could be contained and controlled. But Elias's arms were around me, and his breathing had deepened into the familiar rhythm that meant he was drifting towards sleep, and I could not bring myself to disturb this moment even as it threatened to destroy everything I thought I understood about myself. I sat frozen in his embrace, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he would be able to hear it, would wake up and ask what was wrong, would somehow sense that the person he had been holding was no longer the safe, manageable friend he thought he knew. But he continued to drift toward sleep, his trust in me so complete that my internal crisis did not register as anything requiring his attention. The relief of finally naming the truth was almost as overwhelming as the terror. For months, I had been living in a state of careful self-deception, explaining away feelings and desires and needs that had been growing stronger every day. Now, sitting in the darkness with Elias sleeping against me, I could finally stop pretending that what I felt was anything other than love, complete and hopeless and more real than anything else in my carefully constructed life. But with that relief came the terrible understanding that there was no going back. I could never again pretend that my feelings for Elias were simple or manageable or appropriate. I could never again tell myself that what I wanted was merely friendship, merely companionship, merely the kind of closeness that men were allowed to share as long as it remained safely undefined. I wanted him in ways I had never allowed myself to want anyone. I wanted to wake up next to him every morning and fall asleep in his arms every night. I wanted to be the person he turned to when he was lonely, when he was scared, when he needed someone to hold him steady in a world that often felt too large and too unpredictable. I wanted to be necessary to him in the way he had become necessary to me. The impossibility of it was so absolute that it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Elias would never love me the way I loved him. He might care for me, might value our friendship, might even continue to seek out this particular kind of intimacy that existed in the gray space between friendship and something else. But he would never look at me with desire, never choose me over the women who would always have first claim on his romantic attention, never understand that what I offered him was not just friendship, but devotion, worship, a love so complete it threatened to redefine everything I thought I knew about myself. As the storm outside began to quiet, and Elias's breathing deepened into genuine sleep, I finally understood the choice that was approaching me with the inevitability of sunrise. I could continue to live in this liminal space, accepting whatever intimacy he was willing to offer while carefully concealing the depth of what I felt. Or I could risk everything by telling him the truth, knowing that the truth would almost certainly destroy whatever we had built together. Either way, I was no longer the person I had been when this evening began. Love had found me despite my best efforts to remain safely hidden, and there was no returning to the careful isolation that had once felt like protection but now felt like a kind of death. The days that followed my revelation passed in a kind of suspended animation. I moved through my routines with the mechanical precision of someone trying to maintain normalcy, while everything fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. In the library, I stared at pages without reading them. In classes, I took notes on lectures I did not hear. At night, I lay awake listening to Elias breathe, the sound both comforting and torturous in ways I could no longer pretend to misunderstand. The weight of silence became a physical thing, pressing against my chest every time he looked at me with trust, every time he reached for the blanket we shared, every time he spoke to me with the easy intimacy of someone who believed he knew exactly who I was and what I wanted from him. I had become a living lie, and the strain of maintaining that deception was eating away at everything I had once considered solid about myself. 2 weeks passed before the breaking point arrived. It came on an ordinary Thursday evening, unremarkable in every way except for how it ended. Elias had been unusually quiet during dinner, picking at his food with the distracted air of someone wrestling with thoughts he could not quite organize. I had learned to recognize these moods, had come to understand that they usually preceded the kind of confessions he would share with me in the darkness under our blanket. I was right. We settled into our familiar positions on the couch, the blue blanket wrapped around both of us, and he began to talk. But this time the words came in a flood, as if something inside him had finally broken open. He told me about a phone call with his father that afternoon, about the careful distance they maintained even when trying to connect, about the way their conversations always seemed to skim the surface of what either of them actually wanted to say. He talked about the loneliness that had been eating at him since childhood, the sense that he was always performing some version of himself that other people expected, while his real self remained hidden, untouchable, unknown. He talked about the friends who came and went, drawn to his surface charm, but never staying long enough to discover what lay beneath it. He talked about relationships that had felt hollow even when they were supposedly meaningful, connections that never seemed to reach the places where he actually lived. I listened with the devotion I had perfected over months of these conversations, but tonight his words felt like knives turning in wounds I had inflicted on myself. Every observation about loneliness, every confession about the distance he felt from other people, felt like an indictment of my own deception. Here he was, trusting me with his deepest vulnerabilities, while I sat beside him hiding the most fundamental truth about who I was and what I wanted from him. The words I had been swallowing for weeks began to build pressure behind my lips. Several times I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him that he did not have to be alone, that I understood his loneliness because I had been living with my own version of it my entire life, that what he was looking for might be closer than he realized. But each time, fear closed my throat, and I returned to the safety of careful listening. Then he said something that cut through my defenses like a blade finding the space between armor plates. He had been talking about a friend from high school who had recently stopped returning his calls, another person who had drifted away without explanation, and his voice carried a weariness that sounded ancient despite his youth. "Why do you always stay?" he said, turning to look at me with eyes that seemed to be searching for something he could not name. "Why do you never leave me when everyone else does?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge, like an invitation, like a door opening onto territory neither of us had ever acknowledged existed. I felt the careful walls I had built around my feelings crack and begin to crumble, felt the weight of months of hidden truth pressing against the fragile barriers that had kept it contained. I could have deflected the question, could have said something about compatibility, about the convenience of our living arrangement, about the natural affection that develops between people who share space and routine. I could have maintained the fiction that what kept me close to him was nothing more than ordinary friendship, ordinary loyalty, ordinary human decency. Instead, I answered with an honesty that felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. "Because I love you." The words escaped before I could stop them, carrying with them the weight of everything I had been hiding, everything I had been afraid to acknowledge even to myself. They seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed, growing larger and more impossible with each second that passed without response. Elias went completely still beside me. I could feel his breathing stop, could sense the shock radiating from his body like heat from a flame. When I finally found the courage to look at him, his eyes were wide with something I could not interpret, something that seemed to contain confusion and recognition and fear in equal measure. The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. I wanted to take the words back, to explain them away as something other than what they were, to return to the safety of the moment before I had destroyed everything with my honesty. But they hung in the air like a confession that could not be unspoken, a truth that had finally found its voice. It was not anger I saw in his face. It was not disgust or rejection or any of the responses I had feared most. Instead, it was something closer to sorrow, to a kind of heartbreak that seemed to encompass not just what I had said, but the impossible situation my words had created. He looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time, as if the person he thought he had known had been replaced by someone completely foreign. "I do not know what to say," he whispered finally, his voice barely audible in the quiet apartment. "I do not know how to respond to that." I understood then that there was no response that could repair what I had broken, no words that could return us to the space we had occupied before my confession had redrawn the boundaries of our relationship. I had spoken a truth that changed everything, and there was no path back to the comfortable ambiguity that had allowed us to exist together without having to name what we were to each other. The recognition that some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed settled over both of us like a weight too heavy to bear. We sat in the expanding silence, no longer touching despite the blanket that still covered us both, and I felt the final remnants of my carefully constructed safety crumble into dust. Whatever came next, whatever shape our relationship would take now that the truth had been spoken, there was no returning to the person I had been before this moment. I had loved him quietly for months, had carried that love like a secret treasure that belonged only to me. Now it existed in the space between us, visible and undeniable and irrevocably real. My world had shifted on its axis, and I was no longer sure which direction was home. The apartment felt different after that night, as if the very air had been altered by the weight of words that could not be taken back. The familiar spaces we had shared for months carried new tensions, invisible boundaries that neither of us knew how to navigate. The comfortable rhythms that had defined our daily life together became careful choreography, each of us moving around the other with the delicate precision of people trying not to disturb something fragile. Elias did not reject me. That might have been easier, cleaner, a definitive ending that would have allowed us both to retreat into clearly defined positions. Instead, he moved through our shared spaces with a gentleness that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. He continued to make coffee for both of us in the morning, continued to ask about my classes, continued to exist in my daily life with the same thoughtful presence he had always brought to our friendship. But something fundamental had shifted in the space between us. The easy physical intimacy that had developed over months of shared blankets and casual touches became something we both approached with careful consideration. He no longer fell asleep against my shoulder without thought. He no longer reached for my hand when he wanted to share something he had seen or read. The unconscious trust that had allowed our bodies to exist in the same space without constant negotiation was gone, replaced by a hyper-awareness that made every interaction feel rehearsed. We never spoke directly about what I had told him. There was no follow-up conversation, no attempt to clarify or contextualize or explain away the confession that had changed everything. Instead, we existed in a kind of suspended state, neither moving forward nor returning to what we had been before. He treated me with the same kindness he had always shown, but now that kindness felt deliberate, chosen, rather than natural expression of affection. I found myself watching him with new eyes, trying to understand what my honesty had cost us both. Sometimes I caught glimpses of sadness in his expression when he thought I was not looking, a kind of grief that seemed to encompass not just what we had lost, but what we had never been able to have. Other times he would start to reach for me in the old familiar ways before catching himself, his hand stopping mid-gesture as if he had remembered something important. The blue blanket remained folded on the back of the couch, and used. Our evening ritual of shared warmth and quiet conversation came to an end without discussion, another casualty of the truth I had been unable to keep contained. Instead, we occupied separate spaces in the living room, reading or studying with the careful distance of people who had learned that some kinds of closeness were no longer safe. 3 weeks after my confession, I found him asleep on the couch one evening when I returned from the library. He had pulled the blue blanket over himself and was curled into the corner cushions with the abandon of someone who had finally surrendered to exhaustion. The sight of him sleeping there, alone under the blanket that had once wrapped around both of us, made something in my chest tighten with a pain so sharp it took my breath away. This time, I did not join him. The invitation that had once felt automatic, inevitable, no longer existed. Instead, I went to the hall closet and pulled out another blanket, one we had never shared, and settled into the armchair across the room. I sat watching the quiet rise and fall of his chest, memorizing the way sleep softened the careful guardedness he now carried during his waking hours. I understood then that this was what resolution looked like. Not the neat conclusion of stories where conflicts are resolved and relationships are restored to their original state, but the messy reality of truth that changes everything it touches. I had spoken my love aloud, and in doing so had transformed our friendship into something that could no longer exist in the space between acknowledgement and denial. The knowledge of what I felt was no longer mine alone. It lived in the apartment with us now, invisible but present, influencing every interaction and conversation. Elias carried the weight of knowing he was loved in ways he could not return, and I carried the weight of having loved someone honest enough to acknowledge that limitation rather than pretending it did not exist. Morning arrived with the pale light of early May filtering through our windows, illuminating a living room that had been permanently altered by the presence of 2 blankets where there had once been one. The distance between the couch and the armchair felt both vast and unbridgeable, a physical manifestation of the emotional territory we could no longer share. But as I sat in that morning light, watching Elias begin to stir under his solitary blanket, I realized that something had been gained in the process of losing everything else. The careful self-deception that had defined my emotional life for years was gone, replaced by a clarity that was painful but undeniably real. I knew who I was now in ways I had never allowed myself to know before. I knew what I wanted, what I was capable of feeling, what love looked like when it was acknowledged rather than hidden. I was no longer the person who lived in careful isolation, rationing affection and desire in doses small enough to remain manageable. I was someone who had loved completely, devastatingly, honestly, and who had found the courage to speak that love aloud despite knowing it could not be returned. The pain of that knowledge was enormous, but so was the strange freedom that came from no longer having to pretend I was someone else. The story of us had not ended the way stories are supposed to end, with resolution and closure and the restoration of equilibrium. Instead, it had ended with the kind of honesty that leaves everyone changed, that creates new realities rather than resolving old conflicts. It was not a happy ending, but it was true, and in that truth I found something that felt more valuable than happiness. As Elias opened his eyes and saw me sitting across the room under my separate blanket, something passed between us that might have been understanding or acceptance, or simply the recognition that we had both survived the collision with a truth too large for the life we had been trying to live together. We had loved each other as much as we were able, in the only ways we knew how, and now we would learn to live with the weight of that honesty. Fragile, devastating, and somehow freeing.